In history, timelines may be divided into ancient, medieval, and modern. But in truth, time flows without boundaries. It is a river that never stops. And so, the history of modern India, too, begins long before modernity as we define it. Our story begins in the 15th century before the mighty Mughals arrived, when sails first pierced the Indian Ocean from the far west. And with them came ambition, profit, faith, and eventually, power. This is the tale of how a small European kingdom, Portugal, changed the Indian subcontinent forever. By the late 1400s, Europe was stirring. The Renaissance had sparked a thirst for knowledge, riches, and distant shores. But trade with the East, especially for spices, silks, and precious stones, had become a nightmare. Arab merchants, controlling the Red Sea and land routes, acted as costly middlemen. After Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the overland routes to India were firmly under Muslim control. European kings grew desperate to find a way around. Portugal, perched at the western edge of Europe, dared to look seaward. Prince Henry the Navigator dreamed of finding a sea route to India both to trade and to fight Islamic power with the sword of Christ. Though he died before his dream was fulfilled, his vision lived on. In 1487, Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, proof that an ocean route was possible. A decade later, in 1497, Vasco da Gama set sail with 3 ships and a dream led by a local pilot named Abdul Majid. They reached the shores of Calicut in May 1498. The waves had been conquered. The Hindu ruler, the Zamorin of Calicut, welcomed these pale-skinned strangers. But the Arab merchants, who dominated the Indian Ocean trade, watched with alarm. They saw not just sailors, but invaders of their monopoly. Vasco da Gama stayed in Calicut for 3 months. When he returned to Portugal, he carried back a rich cargo, spices, silks, and stories of a land overflowing with wealth. The profit he earned was beyond imagination. The pepper alone, once bought through Muslim traders, was now 10 times cheaper. And so, the race began. More ships arrived. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral followed, but his expedition turned violent. When the Portuguese trading post in Calicut was attacked, Cabral responded with fury. Arab ships were seized, cargoes looted, and the city was bombarded. This was no longer trade. This was conquest masked as commerce. The Portuguese dream was no longer just to buy spices. It was to control the entire Indian Ocean trade. The Portuguese built fortresses in Cananor, Cochin, and Calicut. They turned merchants into soldiers, traders into tyrants. In 1505, Francisco de Almeida arrived as the first governor of Portuguese India. His goal was clear: crush the Arab merchants and rule the seas. He envisioned a blue water policy dominion, not over land, but over the ocean. The Indian Ocean, once a shared space for Indian, Arab, and Southeast Asian traders, was now turning into a battleground. But resistance came from the Mamelukes of Egypt and the Sultan of Gujarat. Almeida's son fell in battle near Diu in 1507. But the next year, Almeida struck back. The combined Egyptian-Gujarati fleet was destroyed. The sea was now Portugal's empire. Then came Afonso de Albuquerque, the man who would transform Portuguese power from a collection of ports into a full-fledged Eastern empire. In 1510, he captured Goa from the Sultan of Bijapur. It became the first Indian territory to fall to European hands since Alexander the Great. Unlike previous conquests, Albuquerque encouraged Portuguese settlers to marry local women. turning conquerors into landlords, artisans, and citizens. He fortified ports, taxed all who sailed without a Portuguese permit, and cut off rivals at sea. The spice route, once open to all, now passed through the shadow of the Portuguese flag. Goa became their capital, and from there, they expanded to Hormuz, Malacca, the East African coast, forming a web of naval power across the Indian Ocean. As Portuguese power grew, so did their reach. In 1529, Nino da Cunha became governor. He shifted the Portuguese headquarters from Cochin to Goa, a strategic move to tighten their grip over western India. Goa wasn't just a port anymore, it became a Portuguese city, with streets echoing with a blend of Konkani and Portuguese, churches rising alongside coconut groves, and the spice-scented air carrying the pulse of a growing empire. Nino da Cunha forged treaties, fought wars, and even got involved in local politics. The island of Bassein was handed over to the Portuguese by Bahadur Shah of Gujarat, in exchange for military help, a deal that would soon backfire. When tensions rose, Bahadur Shah was killed during negotiations on a Portuguese ship. Elsewhere, in Bengal, the Portuguese planted their flag in Hooghly. They traded salt and tobacco, but also smuggled slaves, including children, a dark stain on their legacy. Religion now followed trade. The Portuguese brought not just cannon and cargo, but also crosses and catechisms. Missionaries arrived with dreams of converting kings. They found one emperor willing to listen, Akbar. Akbar invited Jesuit priests to his court in Fatehpur Sikri in 1580. He listened to their sermons with curiosity, offered respect, but refused to convert. Still, the Jesuits stayed. They debated theology, built churches, and left behind detailed letters, valuable records of Mughal India. Later, under Jahangir, the Jesuits received land and liberty. Baptisms were performed in Agra and Lahore. There was hope in the air. Perhaps even the emperor might convert. But that hope faded as political tides turned. The English now appeared on the western horizon. In 1608, Captain William Hawkins arrived in Surat with a letter from King James I for the Mughal emperor. Despite Portuguese attempts to block him, Hawkins was welcomed by Jahangir, made a Mansabdar, and even married locally. The Portuguese monopoly was unraveling. Soon after, English ships began defeating Portuguese fleets. In 1612, Captain Best repelled them in battle. Jahangir was impressed. In 1613, the Portuguese attacked Mughal ships. The emperor had had enough. Under Shah Jahan, things worsened. The Portuguese were accused of piracy and kidnapping. Their base in Hooghly was besieged and destroyed. Hundreds were taken prisoner, and the Portuguese lost their footing in Bengal forever. By the 18th century, Portuguese influence had shrunk. Once masters of sea lanes, they were now outmatched by the Dutch, the English, and later, the French. Internal weaknesses, arrogance, forced conversions, and piracy had made them unwelcome. The Marathas captured several of their territories. Trade routes shifted. Goa declined. Brazil, not India, became Portugal's new jewel, and yet they lingered. Even as European empires rose and fell, the Portuguese held on to Goa, Daman, and Diu until 1961, when they were finally reclaimed by the Indian government. Despite their harshness, the Portuguese left a lasting imprint. They introduced new crops like cashew and tobacco. They influenced Indian music, art, and architecture, churches with simple forms but intricate interiors, filigree goldwork in Goa, and a fusion cuisine that still thrives. Militarily, they showed how sea power could shape empires. Their tactics influenced Indian powers like the Mughals and Marathas, and taught the English and Dutch how to rule from the coast. They were the first Europeans to arrive and the last to leave. The story of the Portuguese is not one of harmony, but of ambition. Of a small kingdom that sailed across oceans, chasing pepper and power, and in doing so, changed the course of Indian history.